Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank you for attending this test case session, feasibility of using real-world data to evaluate thermal ablation of liver tumors. Next slide. My name is Keonde. I'm going to be moderating this session. I'm a project manager at NEST. For this discussion, we also have Dr. Shuming Zhang, Director of Regulatory Real-World Evidence and Epidemiology, Medical Devices at Johnson & Johnson. We have Dr. Shrikant Vemulapalli, Assistant Professor of Medicine, core faculty member at the Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy. And then we also have Dr. Anjana Jain, Team Lead, Non-Light-Based Energy Devices Team, Office of Surgical and Infection Control Devices, Center for Devices and Radiological Health at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Next slide. This study, the data source is focused on electronic health records. This was a retrospective study that lasted roughly about 16 months, and this study did wrap up earlier this year in January. The particular disease area is in surgery, and the technology of interest is a Johnson & Johnson surgical ablation device, a Class 2 device. Next slide. And I just want to go over a few important items regarding the test case, the relevance, and then the role that NEST played in the project. So when these opportunities came to NEST, there was a specific set of criteria that NEST was looking for. And this particular test case assessed the ability for our NEST research networks to reliably and validly capture real-world data on surgical devices with a general indication for use, to study safety and effectiveness to support a more specific indication. This project also assessed the feasibility of capturing specified outcomes and those clinical covariates using data collected by 4 quaternary healthcare systems. NEST's role, serving as a reliable resource and moving the test case forward, providing overall project guidance and programmatic support and clarity when needed, and addressing those concerns in a timely manner. Also, the NEST role in this study was to streamline the contractual process between institutions through the creation of standardized documents and bidirectional data use agreements, which significantly reduced time spent on regulatory work. And I'd like to thank you, and I'll hand it off to Dr. Shuming Zhang.
Great, thank you. Today's discussion will focus on several topics. First, I will present the technology of interest and rationale why Johnson & Johnson proposed the original test case, and the study objective. And then I will hand over to Shrik. He's going to present the study design and the execution, device and the population identification, and the final result and the validation. And Shrik and I will share lessons learned and the test case experience. Next slide, please. This is my disclosure slide. Opinions expressed are those of an individual employee of Johnson & Johnson, not those of Johnson & Johnson, and are not necessarily endorsed by Johnson & Johnson. Next slide, please. The new wave microwave ablation system is a Class 2 device that was originally cleared in 2010 through a 510(k) pathway as the soft tissue ablation tool. A non-resectable liver tumor indication was added in 2018. A desired further label change through the next test case is to add the word malignant to the label, to change it from the soft tissue ablation instrument to a cancer treatment device. Next slide, please. Why did Johnson & Johnson propose the original test case? We thought the next test case would be a great opportunity to advance the use of real-world evidence for regulatory decisions in the medical devices. Registry-based real-world evidence had been used for label extensions for medical devices. However, registry of specialized real-world data sources can be resource intensive because they require significant effort and resources, including general lines and the training data abstractor to manually extract and enter many data elements. Additionally, registries are not available for all types of devices. They are usually specialized to certain disease conditions with a limited number of the variables due to the cost of time needed for data abstraction. And registration can also be maybe slow to accrue. Patients have small sample sizes or high drop-off rate and include only skilled experienced operators from the high volume size. Large electronic health record and claim databases may be able to address many of these limitations of registry and have the potential to generate real-world evidence for regulatory decisions, especially for rare life-threatening diseases that have limited treatment options like malignant liver tumors. Due to their large sample sizes and geographic coverage, large databases are in general more representative of the population of interest. Because the large bases are aggregated from the data collected during the routine clinical care, they can quickly provide insight into the safety performance of devices using the usual clinical practices. However, it was not fully clear if they can capture relevant and reliable data regarding the device use and procedural clinical outcome cohorts for device label extension for cancer treatment. Next slide, please. This test case was a single-arm feasibility study of using the real-world data for the new-wave microwave ablation system label extension to treat malignant liver tumors. The study focused on assessing the availability of device use, procedure of interest, cohorts, and outcomes. Goal of the test case was to explore the feasibility of assessing and capture real-world data regarding the use of new wave microwave ablation system for small non-resectable malignant liver tumors in the four independent health system electronic data system, including electronic health record, and to assess whether real-world data are robust enough to be used for label extension study for new wave microwave ablation system to extend the device label from tool for the purpose of ablating liver tumor to a device approved for ablation in non-resectable malignant tumors. To achieve this goal, the study had three specific aims to assess the feasibility of identifying device use and capturing cohorts and select outcomes using the data selected by four quaternary health care systems. With that, I'm now turning over to Shrek. He's going to present the study design execution and the device patient populations and the final result validation. Shrek.
Thank you, Shumen. So we actually designed and executed the study in much the way that Shumen just described. So specifically at each of the four participating institutions, we asked the sites to use either their EHR, their financial records or purchasing records or existing institutional databases to try to identify use of the new wave device. They would then query that data, abstract it, and get identified patient data from that, which is specific to their institution. Now, in order to avoid sending specific data out of the institutions for aggregation at the data coordinating center, we actually had the sites de-identify that information, create and keep a crosswalk locally so that they would be able to re-identify the information if needed, and instead assign a study number to the patient and send that to the coordinating center, which was here at Duke. Next slide, please. So a little bit more detail about how we did this. In fact, we had multiple different data streams to try to get all the data elements that we were interested in. So if you start first here with the image on the right, you'll see we actually had procedural data from J&J that we wanted to link with the site based data. So J&J actually sent procedural data to each of the four participating sites. The sites then linked that data with their own local data and then sent that to the coordinating center. Now, if you look here on the left with this flow diagram, actually within each site, there were two data streams. First, there was a common data model query that was sent from a central location, in this case, the coordinating center, Duke, to each of these sites to run against their existing EHR data models. Second, for elements that we felt could not be ascertained through a common data model, we actually asked the sites to use existing either EHR, manual abstraction, or existing registry resources to supplement data. So coming back here to the image on the right, we had data coming from J&J, which went to the sites. The sites integrated that with their own existing resource, whether that was EHR or existing registry. And on top of that, a centralized query was sent from the coordinating center to the site and then run against the site's data model and sent back to the center along with the site's individual EHR or registry data. Together, all of those data sources were then aggregated at the coordinating center for data analysis. Next slide, please. So I'll talk a little bit more specifically about the device population and identification, and this was done somewhat differently at each of the 4 participating sites. We'll start here with Mayo, who actually used the Global Unique Device Identification ID within their system, specifically their supply chain database, and identified use of the New Wave device in that way. That identification was then run against their EHR, their existing ablation and cancer registry to actually produce the appropriate data. We can contrast that actually to what was done at Vanderbilt, where CPT codes for ablation procedures were used, followed by keyword searches of notes in the charts of those patients, and then those were all verified by manual chart review. At Duke, we had a search using our Enterprise Data Unified Content Explorer to identify use of any type of ablation device, and then verification of use of the New Wave device by manual chart review. And then finally, at Cornell, there was an existing ablation database that was mined and then manually chart reviewed for verification of use of the New Wave device. Next slide. And here are some of the data that we acquired from the sites and then aggregated. And I'll point out a few things here. First, in the columns, you can see the aggregated data, which is about not quite 550 patients. And then you can see the data broken down by site. You'll see here in the rows, a number of these entries are in yellow. And these are the entries, the ones that have an N of 546. These are the entries that were derived from the centralized query that was sent and run to each site, then run against their common data models. Whereas these ones that have N's of lower than 546 were abstracted by the sites through various methods, including either manual chart review, as I talked about on the last slide, or potential use of existing data resources, such as existing site registries at each of the sites. And I'll also point out the breadth of this. So the common data model, often we queried for things that were what I call fairly generic, things like age, gender, but then much more specific data elements, such as Eastern Cooperative Oncology Group scores, and ascites, encephalopathy, things that are very difficult to query by administrative claims, were done using local registries or manual chart abstraction. And you can see here the difference in N's because some of these data elements were not available at all of the sites. And so if I were to sum up this table, what we saw was a significant amount of variability in the completeness of data elements by site. And there was also variability in data elements and their completeness based on whether we could derive them from the automated query, which was run against common data model, or whether this went straight to the EHR or existing site registries. And then again, we see significant differences by site in terms of availability of some of these data elements. Now, clinically speaking, if you actually look across the data here, there are some significant differences in the populations that underwent new wave ablation by site. So what you're seeing here, for instance, if we look at the ECOG performance status, is you're actually seeing at Mayo about 75% of the patients were ECOG performance status 0. So that's 75% of all the Mayo patients. Whereas, for example, at Duke, only about 45% of the patients had ECOG status 0, and there was a larger percentage at status 1 or status 2. So again, we're seeing some difference in methodology, but also we're seeing coming through here a difference in patient populations that are being treated with this device. Next slide, please. And here I'm showing a table of prior treatments that this patient population had received before undergoing liver ablation with the new wave device. And again, we see variation in patient population by site. So if we take a look at the Mayo data again here, there's a pretty significant percentage of patients that had systemic chemotherapy, much less prevalent here in the Cornell data, where only 5% of their patients had prior chemotherapy. And again, you see the differences here in terms of prior radiofrequency ablation between the Mayo site and say Cornell or Duke or Vandy. Next slide, please. Importantly, I mentioned on the method slide that we actually integrated procedure-specific data from J&J to the site data and then aggregated it all. So some of the procedure-specific data are given here in this table at the top. Number of probes used in the ablation, number of ablation cycles in the ablation. This all came from the control unit of the device through J&J back to each individual site and then aggregated at the coordinating center. And you can see here we did this successfully across all of the sites. And this table combines that information with manually abstracted information from the EHR or existing site-specific registries regarding the size of the largest lesion treated, the target lesion, and the number of lesions present at the time of the initial ablation attempt. I'd like to move here to the table at the bottom left, because these are our short-term outcomes. You can see here immediate technical success and then a lot of 30-day complications. We actually had very, very good technical success across all of the sites, and the completeness of this data was quite good as well. Again, 30-day outcomes, including bleeding, infection, skin burns, diaphragmatic injury, etc. We were pretty successful in being able to obtain those across all the sites, and these were generally done through either existing registry or manual abstraction. I want to point your attention here to the graph on the right. So what this graph is depicting is time to cancer progression defined as a change in the size of the tumor. But the important part of this graph here is actually the number at risk on the bottom of the x-axis. You can see here the number at risk really starts to kind of fall off between 2 and 3 months after the ablation, the initial ablation. And so what I want to point out here is one of the weaknesses of the data collection, which is that as time goes on, even out to 6 months, we start to lose our ability to follow these patients. So that would be one of our major findings in terms of long-term follow-up. There's a significant limitation to being able to do that, relying only on local EHR or registry data. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, in terms of the data, we do think it's feasible to identify new wave device use, although the capabilities to do this varied from site to site. We saw anything from UDI use to CPT code with manual abstraction and confirmation. And then generic comorbidity assessments, things like diabetes, heart failure, et cetera, things that are very well coded using administrative codes and have validated coding algorithms to identify them, were fairly successful across all the sites. Although there was some difference in terms of the underlying data warehouse structures used by each institution that required some tweaking to be able to get this data using a centralized query. The feasibility of returning procedural data to multiple sites and linking with EMR data was also established. We did that successfully across all 4 of the participating sites. And we felt that the short-term safety and efficacy outcome data was excellent But again, the method for obtaining this varied by sites. Some sites did manual abstraction, whereas others used existing site registries, which again had been populated through manual abstraction. And one major point is that long-term efficacy outcomes were really hampered by loss to follow-up and lack of a what I'll call mortality sweep, meaning we did not go through and ask each site at the end to say, look for the last known contact with the patient and assume based on that that the patient is still alive. That probably would have improved our results somewhat. So with that, I will turn it back over to Shumen.
Thank you, Shrek. In terms of lessons learned and the test case experience, we feel that the multidisciplinary team is critical. This test case formed a collaborative, cross-functional, cross-institutional team to execute this study. Team members have strong expertise in epidemiology, real-world data sciences, medical and clinical, and including interventional oncology, bioinformatics, and regulatory affairs, and extensive experience in conducting multi-institutional study, such as the CORNET. Results from this study also show that the unique devices can be identified in health system electronic data system. And each health system, as Shrek mentioned, use a unique approach. The study was able to obtain aggregate data from multiple sites regarding the use of the device and the covered outcome from multiple data sources successfully. Because of the detailed oncology data, such as the tumor stage size and the ECOG, are not routinely available from structured EHR, we had to rely on the chart review to get such data from the tumor registry. Structured EHR data need to be enhanced to include additional detail of oncology data. The approaches such as linkage with the Medicare claim databases or through patient-centered digital health data sharing platform that track the data in multiple EHR systems could enhance the long-term follow-up data. We had a great experience in these test cases. And next test case provide opportunity for innovation. As Shrek mentioned, an innovative aspect of this test case is the linkage of machine-generated data with the electronic health record data within each site to facilitate the device identification and provide additional procedure data. This test case also provides a great opportunity for collaboration among the stakeholders, and that's to bring all stakeholders in the medical device ecosystem together, provide a neutral platform for collaboration between the industry partners and academic institutions, and the opportunity to deepen understanding of real-world data sources for regulatory decisions, and communicate this with the FDA. And then that's also facilitate dialogue with FDA about using the real-world evidence for regulatory decisions, which provide the insights into the real-world evidence requirement for regulatory decisions. We believe learnings and the foundational work from next test cases can help pave the pathway to use the real-world data to understand the device safety and the performance to support the regulatory decisions. Last and not least, we would like to thank you all for your support for this study. So now I'm going to turn over to next speaker, Dr. Anjina Jain from FDA. Anjina.
Thank you, Dr. Zhang, for the introduction. Good afternoon. I'm the team lead for the non-light-based energy devices team in the Office of Surgical and Infection Control Devices at the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. I will be giving a brief perspective on the FDA's and in specifically our teams on the use of real-world evidence to support indications for use of thermoablative products. Next slide, please. I will begin with the FDA perspective and specifically CDRH's mission, which is to protect and promote the public health. In doing so, we assure that patients and providers have timely and continued access to safe, effective, and high-quality medical devices and safe radiation-emitting products. We provide consumers, patients, their caregivers, and providers with understandable and accessible science-based information about the products we oversee. It should be noted that U.S. post-market surveillance, quickly identifies poorly performing devices, accurately characterizes real-world performance, and facilitates device approval or clearance. Consumers, patients, their caregivers, and providers have access to understandable science-based information about medical devices to make healthcare decisions. Next slide, please. The FDA and CDRH are committed to helping patients gain more timely access to new medical devices and to maintaining continued access to existing medical devices that are high quality, safe, and effective by expediting their development, assessment, review, and surveillance consistent with the agency's statutory mission. We have implemented the least burdensome approach to medical device pre-market evaluation in a manner that eliminates unnecessary burdens that may delay the marketing of beneficial new products, while maintaining the statutory requirements for clearance and approval. The FDA defines least burdensome to be the minimum amount of information necessary to adequately address a relevant regulatory question or issue through the most efficient manner at the right time. Examples of using least burdensome sources include the use of clinical data, non-clinical data, accepting alternative approaches, reducing the burden of traditional clinical studies, using benefit risk assessments, and balancing pre-market and post-market information needs. As with this NEST test case presented today, alternative sources of clinical data, such as real-world evidence, may be considered when appropriate and, in many cases, may be the least burdensome means for assessing device safety and effectiveness and for other regulatory decision-making. In the 21st Century Cures Act that was passed in 2016, additional focus was placed on the use of real-world evidence to support regulatory decision-making. The FDA defines real-world data as data related to patient health status and/or the delivery of healthcare routinely collected from a variety of sources, such as electronic health records, data from product and disease registries, and patient-generated data. Real-world evidence is defined as the clinical evidence regarding the usage and potential benefits or risks of a medical product derived from analysis of real-world data. Under the right conditions, real-world evidence may be suitable to support the clearance or approval of a new device, or the expansion of the indications for use of devices that are already on the market. For further information on CDRH's approach to the least burdensome principles in real-world evidence, you may refer to the guidance documents, the Least Burdensome Principles, Concepts and Principles, issued on February 5th of 2019, and Use of Real-World Evidence to Support Regulatory Decision-Making that was issued on August 31st of 2017. The links for these guidance documents are provided on this slide. Next slide, please. Having discussed the basic information on the least burdensome approach and use of real-world evidence, we may now specifically talk about thermal ablation devices such as the Certus 140 microwave ablation system in this NEST test case. Thermal ablation products with a general indication, such as ablation or coagulation of soft tissue, typically do not require clinical data. An expansion of this indication for more specific, higher risk indications may generally rely upon clinical data. For example, the general indication was expanded to include ablation or coagulation of soft tissue in percutaneous, open surgical, and in conjunction with laparoscopic surgical settings, including the partial or complete ablation of non-resectable liver tumors. The Certus 140 microwave ablation device and other devices previously cleared for these indications provided clinical data. To expand the indications for use of the ablation of liver tumors, real-world evidence of adequate quality may be used to support the regulatory decision-making. For the thermoablative devices, such as the Certus 140 microwave ablation system, with the indication provided in bullet number 2 on this slide, real-world evidence was used to support the regulatory decision-making. To support the indication expansion for use of this previously cleared device, review of the literature and meta-analysis was conducted to compare the technique efficacy of microwave ablation to radiofrequency ablation for the treatment of liver tumors. For this, a total of 1,379 citations were identified from database searching. After screening, 18 studies consisting of a total of 1,924 patients were included in the meta-analysis. 15 studies use a percutaneous approach for ablation, and 3 studies use a laparoscopic approach. Various parameters were retrieved, such as study authors, publication year, study timeframe, study design, country of origin, sample size, key patient characteristics, intervention, comparator details, and detailed outcome data for the literature review and meta-analysis. The non-clinical data and real-world evidence demonstrate that the Certus 140 microwave ablation system and probes can reach target tumors in the liver using the open, percutaneous, and laparoscopic tissue access methods, and was used to justify substantial equivalence. Next slide, please. The use of real-world evidence from NEST has the potential to be used in regulatory submissions in this device space if it is of sufficient quality. However, to mitigate the potential bias, a careful study design is needed, as well as to ensure the appropriate endpoints and measure of success are included to support the indications for use or expansion of the indications. The Office of Surgical and Infection Control Devices and our team recommend that you consider using the pre-submission process while developing your study using real-world data. For additional information on the Q-Submission program and the pre-submission process, please refer to the guidance document, Requests for Feedback and Meetings for Medical Device Submissions, the Q-Submission program, which was reissued on January 6, 2021. Now we will go into our live audio Q&A.